Miami, Florida, is a city of sun-drenched beaches, luxury high-rises, and an electric nightlife. But behind the neon glow and the crashing waves, there exists another Miami. A grittier, less forgiving Miami. A place where the streets hum with desperation, where those struggling with addiction and homelessness fight to survive in the shadows of wealth. Between 1995 and 1996, darkness crept into this forgotten part of the city. Women were vanishing, only to be found later, beaten, burned, and discarded like trash in alleys, cemeteries, and abandoned lots. Their bodies bore the same brutal signature, a crushing blow to the head followed by fire. At first, police weren't sure what they were dealing with. Were these unrelated attacks, drug-related violence, accidents? But when the bodies kept appearing, a horrifying realization set in. A predator was among them. A man who stalked his victims in the dead of night, lured them in, and left them charred beyond recognition. These women had names. They had families, histories, and dreams, lives that should never have ended the way they did. And though they had struggled, they did not deserve to become footnotes in Miami's crime history. They were not just victims, they were daughters, mothers, and friends. Their stories mattered. Each of the women who fell prey to this faceless killer had walked a difficult path. Addiction had tightened its grip on them, pulling them into dangerous situations. But before the streets, before the struggle, they had been so much more. At 42, Vida Hicks had seen both the highs and lows of life. Those who knew her said she had once been full of life, with a laugh that could lift the mood in any room. She had been a bright student in her younger years, passionate about music and poetry. But circumstances and addiction had led her to the streets, where every day was a battle for survival. Despite it all, she held on to hope. She told friends she wanted to turn things around, that one day she would break free from the life she had fallen into. Diane, known as Miss D by those around her, was 44. She was tough, sharp-tongued, and street-smart. Though life had been unkind to her, she still dreamed of something better. She spoke of leaving Miami, of getting out before it was too late. But life on the streets doesn't always allow for second chances. At 37, Cheryl still had dreams. She had once worked as a hairdresser, a job she loved before drugs took over. She had a son she adored, though she struggled with the shame of not being the mother she wanted to be. She still visited family when she could, but those visits became less frequent as her addiction deepened. Janice, also 37, had once been a promising dancer. She loved music, and before her life spiraled, she had performed on small stages, losing herself in the rhythm. She was a well-known face in her neighborhood, always stopping to chat and smiling despite her struggles. 4 women, each with their battles, but none of them deserved what was coming. It began with Vida Hicks. She was last seen near Miami's bustling produce market, a familiar place where many in the homeless community gathered. Hours later, her body was discovered. She had been burned so severely that the mesh pattern of her clothing had been seared into her skin. But it was the head trauma that told investigators the truth. This was no accident. Someone had beaten her before setting her on fire. Then, just 30 feet away, another discovery. Another burned body, another woman beaten beyond recognition. This time, it was Diane Helms. The Miami Homicide Unit scrambled. 2 victims, killed in the same way, were found in the same area. This was a pattern. Then, before detectives could even make sense of it, another body surfaced. Cheryl Ray was found in a cemetery, burned from the waist up. Again, the same brutal method. And then, the last victim. Janice Cox was discovered inside an abandoned gas station. Around her, ceiling tiles littered the floor. But there, in the dust and debris, a crucial clue. Footprints in transmission fluid. Someone had walked through the crime scene. Someone had left behind a trail. Miami detectives worked tirelessly, sifting through clues, chasing dead ends, desperate for a lead. The killer was targeting women in a specific area. He was brutal, methodical, and unrelenting. But who was he? And how could he be stopped before another woman lost her life? Then a break in the case. A woman named Yolanda, a prostitute, approached the police. She had barely escaped death a year earlier when a man, Spanish-speaking, aggressive, had attacked her. He had asked if she spoke Spanish. When she answered, he hit her over the head. She managed to flee and even filed a police report. Now she had seen him again, riding a bicycle. Detectives responded immediately. And there, on a Miami street, they found him. A man on a bicycle carrying a plastic bag. Inside, a juice bottle filled with gasoline. His name, Francisco del Junco. Francisco del Junco was a Cuban immigrant who had arrived in the U.S. during the 1980 Mariel boat lift. His past was riddled with mental illness. He suffered from hallucinations, paranoia, and delusions. He had been in and out of psychiatric care, but time and time again he was deemed not a threat to society. But now he was the prime suspect in a string of gruesome murders. During questioning, Del Junco's story took a bizarre turn. He spoke of Santeria, a religion practiced in the Caribbean. He claimed a Santeria priestess controlled his urges, making him ejaculate involuntarily. He believed black women were her followers, and that killing them would free him from her grip. At first, detectives weren't sure if this was a delusion or an excuse, but as they pressed him, something shifted. When one of them mentioned Santeria, Del Junco's demeanor changed. His voice lowered. His eyes darkened. "Can we go somewhere else to talk?" he asked. And that's when the confession began. Del Junco led investigators to the exact locations where he had left the bodies. He described each attack in chilling detail, how he had lured the women in, how he had struck them with a metal pipe, and how he had set their bodies on fire. The details were horrifying, but they were also undeniable. He was their killer. In May 2003, Francisco del Junco stood trial for 4 counts of first-degree murder. His defense? Insanity. But under Florida law, insanity requires that the defendant be unable to tell right from wrong. Del Junco had covered his tracks. He had tried to hide what he had done. He knew. After 6 weeks, the verdict came down. Guilty. He was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences, ensuring that he would never again walk free. He was sent to the Union Correctional Institution, where he remains to this day. For the families, justice was bittersweet. Their daughters, mothers, and sisters were gone. But at least the man who had taken them would never harm another soul. And as Miami moved on, the fires of his crimes faded. The streets whispered his name no more. But for those who remember, the scars remain. Marlene Major was not just a name in an old case file. He was a mother, a daughter, and a woman with dreams, love, and a life that mattered. Before she became the subject of whispered suspicions and cold case investigations, she was a young woman full of life. She had a laugh that could light up a room, a kindness that drew people in, and a fierce love for her children. She was the kind of mother who took pride in the little things, packing lunches, tucking her children in at night, humming a tune as she folded laundry. To the outside world, she was just another wife and mother, but to those who truly knew her, she was so much more. But Marlene's life was not easy. She was married to Bill Major, a man who had a darkness inside him. He wasn't the kind of man who showed his rage in public, but behind closed doors, he was someone else entirely. The control, the cruelty, the suffocating grip he had over Marlene. It was a prison she couldn't escape. Still, she endured it. Not for herself, but for her children. Lalana Bramble, Marlene's daughter, was only 4 years old when her mother disappeared. At that age, she didn't fully understand what had happened. All she knew was that her mother had been there one day and was gone the next. And when she asked questions, her father gave her answers that didn't sit right, even to a child. She was a drug addict, he told her, an alcoholic, a prostitute. She didn't care about you, she ran off with another man. It was the kind of story that was meant to end conversations, not invite more questions. It was the kind of lie that Bill Major hoped his children would believe without hesitation. But as the years passed, Lalana began to see the cracks. Her father was not a man to be trusted. He was abusive, violent, and cold, and as she grew older, she began to suspect that the story he had told her was just that, a story. The truth, she feared, was far darker. Then, a year after Marlene disappeared, something was found in the woods. A skull fragment, stripped of its jaw and teeth, was discovered not far from the home Marlene had shared with Bill. It was impossible to tell who it had belonged to, and in the days before DNA testing, there was no way to confirm anything. The case, already cold, was left to collect dust. Years turned into decades. Bill Major continued on with his life, free and unbothered. He raised his children, fed them lies about their mother, and lived as though nothing had ever happened, but Lalana never forgot. She carried the weight of her mother's absence with her, and as she grew into adulthood, that weight became impossible to ignore. She confronted her father. "Just tell me what you did with her body," she said, "so we can bury her. I won't push for you to be prosecuted. I just want to know." But Bill Major only laughed. "If you think I'm going to tell you where your mother's body is," he said, "you're crazy." At that moment, Lalana knew. There was no longer room for doubt. Her father had killed her mother, and if he thought she would let it go, he was wrong. The investigation reopens. By the year 2000, Lalana had spent 2 decades living in the shadow of her mother's disappearance, but she refused to let it be forgotten. She walked into the Boone County Courthouse and demanded that someone listen to her. That someone was newly elected prosecutor, Linda Tally Smith. Smith had a reputation for closing cases that others had abandoned, and when she heard Lalana's story, she knew this was one of those cases that couldn't be ignored. First, they needed to prove that the skull found all those years ago belonged to Marlene. Special investigator Todd Kenner was called in, and using modern forensic techniques, he began the process of confirming what many had long suspected. A DNA test was conducted, comparing a sample from the skull to a sample from Lalana. The results were undeniable. The skull belonged to Marlene Major. Now, after 2 decades, Marlene was no longer just missing. She was confirmed dead. But how had she died? Forensic anthropologist Dr. Emily Craig examined the skull and made a chilling discovery. There was a gunshot wound to the head, with an exit wound at the top of the skull. This was no accident, no disappearance. This was murder. And there was more. There were deep cuts along the bone, signs of an attempt at decapitation. The marks were straight and deliberate, as if made by a thick-bladed weapon like an axe, and even more horrifying, there was clear evidence that someone had intentionally removed Marlene's jaw. The reason was clear. Her killer had wanted to prevent her from being identified. All signs pointed to Bill Major. But the investigators needed more. A killer's own words. Bill Major had been careful for years, but in 1996, he had made a mistake. During a phone call with his own father, Jim Major, Bill had allegedly confessed. "I killed Marlene," he had said. But the call had not been recorded, and Jim Major's word alone wasn't enough to convict his son. So investigators decided to try again. In 2000, Jim Major agreed to let police record a conversation between him and Bill. It was a long shot, but they hoped Bill would slip up. And he did. On the recorded call, Jim asked his son one simple question. "Why won't you tell me where you buried Marlene?" There was a pause on the line. Finally, Bill spoke. "Yeah," he said, "and put me in jail for life." It was a confession. There was no denial, no outrage at the accusation, just a statement that if he told the truth, he would be locked away forever. It was all investigators needed. Bill Major was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Justice, at last. In court, the evidence was overwhelming. The skull, the DNA test, the confession, all of it pointed to one conclusion. Bill Major had murdered his wife, dismembered her body, and spent 2 decades living free. The jury took less than an hour to reach a verdict. Guilty. Bill Major was sentenced to life in prison in a Kentucky correctional facility. For some, the punishment was not enough. "If I could get my hands on him," one family member said, "I'd hang him myself." For Lalana, the conviction was a step toward healing. She had spent her entire life haunted by what had happened to her mother, but now, after years of pain and unanswered questions, she finally had some measure of peace. "I've always felt guilty," she admitted, "because in my mind she died trying to protect us from him. Now, at last, Marlene Major could rest, and the man who had taken her life would never walk free again." Marlene Major's story is one of heartbreak, injustice, and perseverance. For 20 years, her children lived with the pain of not knowing, the frustration of unanswered questions, and the agony of suspecting the one man who was supposed to protect them. But it is also a story of resilience, the relentless fight of a daughter who refused to let her mother's memory fade into the cold files of an unsolved case. Justice, though delayed, was finally served. Bill Major, once confident that he had committed the perfect crime, now spends the rest of his days behind bars, paying for the unspeakable horrors he inflicted upon his wife and children. But for victims of domestic violence, justice is not always guaranteed. Marlene's story is a tragic reminder that too many women suffer in silence, trapped in abusive relationships with no way out. Many don't get the chance to escape. Some, like Marlene, lose their lives at the hands of the very person who vowed to love them. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, don't wait. There is help, there are resources, there are people ready to listen, support, and protect. In the U.S., you can call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-79-9-SAFE. If you are in immediate danger, call 911. No one should have to live in fear. No one should have to fight alone. Marlene Major's voice was silenced, but her story speaks for so many others. Let it serve as a call to action, to stand up, to speak out, and to ensure that justice is not something that comes decades too late.
In the quiet streets of Muskogee, Oklahoma, once lived a young girl named Erica Green. She was the kind of child who brought joy to everyone around her. Just shy of 4 years old, Erica had a bright, radiant smile and a laugh that echoed through the hallways of her school. Teachers, neighbors, and friends would often remark on her enthusiasm. Her infectious spirit lit up the room. At school, Erica was known for her curious nature and her love of drawing. She loved to create pictures of animals, her favorite being horses, which she would spend hours sketching during class. But above all, her greatest passion was for life itself. Every day was a new adventure for her, whether it was running around with her friends or discovering something new in the world around her. Erica's home life, though, was far less idyllic. Her mother, Michelle Johnson, and her stepfather, Harold Johnson, were often seen around the neighborhood. Despite the warmth that Erica radiated, there were signs that things weren't always well behind the closed doors of her home. While the family had their moments of happiness, there was a cloud that seemed to hang over them, an atmosphere of tension, instability, and even fear. Harold, her stepfather, had a reputation for being volatile, especially when he was using drugs. Michelle, her mother, seemed distant, often preoccupied with personal struggles. Erica's life was cut short before she could truly explore her potential. She had yet to discover the many gifts the world had to offer, but in the brief time she was given, she touched the lives of many and left an imprint on the hearts of those who knew her. April 28, 2001, was a day that would change everything for Erica's family and the community that loved her. On that fateful day, everything seemed to fall apart. It started like any other day. Erica, though a handful, had no reason to suspect that the chaos of her home would consume her. Her mother and stepfather were in their world, grappling with the consequences of their actions. Harold, in a fit of rage, lashed out at Erica, seemingly over something small, something trivial that escalated in an instant. The violence that unfolded was brutal. Erica, small and vulnerable, became the victim of an unthinkable crime. Harold, in his fury, struck her with such force that her head hit the ground with a sickening crack. As the minutes passed, Erica's body went limp, her eyes rolling back as she lost consciousness. In his panic, Harold did nothing to save her. Neither he nor Michelle sought medical attention for Erica, both fearing the legal consequences of their actions. Instead, they allowed their child to die most cruelly and negligently. What followed was even more horrifying. Harold, in an attempt to cover up the crime, decapitated Erica's lifeless body with a pair of hedge clippers. They discarded her remains in a nearby field, leaving her mutilated body in a state that no one should ever have to endure. For the next several days, Erica's disappearance went unnoticed by the public, and her family, tragically, did nothing to raise the alarm. The discovery of Erica's body was a grim revelation. A volunteer stumbled upon her dismembered torso in a field on April 30th, 2001, just days after her death. The rest of her remains would be found days later, but her identity was unknown. The community, desperate for answers, called her Precious Doe, a name that would haunt the hearts of many. The police investigation, led by Detective Dave Bernard, struggled to find any leads. Precious Doe's identity remained a mystery for months. Despite a growing stack of evidence and theories, no solid leads were found, and the case grew cold. But Bernard couldn't let go of the case. He continued digging, determined to find the identity of the girl whose life had been so tragically taken. Months passed, and the community began to lose hope. Precious Doe's identity seemed more elusive than ever. However, just when it seemed all was lost, a breakthrough emerged. A sculptor in Louisiana, Mary Manheen, specializing in reconstructing faces from skulls, was brought into the case. With her expertise, the team hoped they might finally be able to create an image of Precious Doe that would lead to her identification. Forensic artist Eileen Barrow worked tirelessly, sculpting the face of the young girl. After weeks of meticulous work, a bust was revealed to the public, and the case was reopened with renewed hope. Then, 2 years later, the breakthrough came from an unlikely source. A community activist named Alonzo Washington, who had been deeply moved by the case, placed an ad in the paper with a picture of the sculpted bust. On April 30th, 2005, Washington's phone rang. At the other end was a man with a shocking revelation. He knew who the girl was. The man, who lived in Oklahoma, explained that Erica Green had been killed by her stepfather, Harold Johnson, and that her mother, Michelle, had been complicit in the crime. Michelle had told him details of the murder while under the influence of drugs. The caller provided critical information that led Bernard and his team of detectives to Oklahoma, where they questioned both Michelle and Harold. In less than an hour, Michelle Johnson broke down and confessed. She revealed how Harold, in a fit of rage, had killed Erica. She confessed that they had not sought medical help for the dying girl, and they had disposed of her body in the woods. Harold Johnson, in a subsequent interview, also confessed to the crime. The case, which had taken over 4 years to crack, finally saw closure. DNA tests confirmed that Precious Doe was, in fact, Erica Green. The long search for answers was finally over. Justice, though delayed, was at hand. In August of 2005, Harold Johnson and Michelle Johnson were arrested and charged with the murder of Erica Green. The case made headlines across the country, and the community of Kansas City, along with Erica's family, were relieved to finally know the truth. It had taken over 4 years, but the search for Precious Doe's identity was over. In court, Harold Johnson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Michelle Johnson, who had played a role in the crime, was sentenced to a lesser term due to her cooperation with the authorities. The sentences did little to bring comfort to the victims of the tragedy. Erica's death left an indelible mark on the lives of those who loved her, and the wounds would never fully heal. As for Harold Johnson, his reaction to being caught was one of defiance. He claimed that he had acted out of anger, but in the coldness of the courtrooms, it was clear that there was no remorse in his eyes. His family, too, was left to grapple with the reality of what he had done. They had to face the truth that one of their own had taken the life of an innocent child. For Michelle Johnson, the weight of her guilt was evident. She had failed as a mother, and her actions had forever scarred her daughter's legacy. In interviews, she expressed regret, but the sorrow of her words could never undo the horrors of that day. For the Green family, justice, though bittersweet, was a necessary part of the healing process. Erica's extended family was able to finally give her a proper burial. The community that had rallied behind Precious Doe could now mourn together, knowing that the little girl's name, Erica Green, would never again be forgotten. The case of Precious Doe, now known as Erica Green, served as a reminder of the frailty of life, the darkness that can sometimes be hidden behind closed doors, and the resilience of a community that refused to let a child's memory fade away. As Erica's family stood by her gravesite, they knew that despite the pain and loss, Erica's life had meaning. Precious Doe would never just be a mystery. She had been a child, a daughter, and a sister, and in the end, she had a name, a face, and a story that would be remembered. As we close the chapter on this heartbreaking case, it serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of justice for those who can no longer speak for themselves. The tragic story of Erica Green, once known only as Precious Doe, proves that no matter how cold a case may seem, there is always hope. The work of dedicated individuals, from forensic experts to community activists, can ultimately lead to the truth coming to light. We encourage you, the audience, to remain vigilant. Don't hesitate to speak up if you or someone you know has information that could help solve a case. Whether it's a missing person, an unsolved crime, or a lingering injustice, your voice can make a difference. Remember, justice is a journey, and every step counts. For more updates on cases like this, or if you're interested in learning more about the role of forensic science in solving cold cases, follow us on our social media channels and continue to support those working tirelessly behind the scenes to give victims a voice. We will never forget Precious Doe now. As Erica Green, she is remembered, and her legacy lives on in the pursuit of justice for all.